I got the impression that people living outside of Indonesia, even in Australia, did not understand the 1998 riots properly, author Dewi Agreye says, reflecting on why she wrote her latest novel, which tells the story of a Chinese-Indonesian woman caught up in the violent protests that led to President Suharto's fall. The 276-page novel, My Pain, My Country, was written and published in English, and looking back at the chaotic events some 20 years later, it seeks to bring cultural nuance to the anti-government protests in which the Chinese community was also specifically targeted, their houses burned down, and many women reportedly raped. In the book, Nina, a young Indonesian woman of Chinese descent, feels compelled to help her fellow student activists during the protests but finds herself in harm's way amid the targeting of Chinese women. Despite the Indonesian government's best efforts to deflect the allegations throughout the book, the lives of many of the novel's characters are forever altered by a series of horrific and traumatic events. After I met with and interviewed some of the perpetrators and victims who had experienced, known, or been involved in the 1998 attacks, I felt a need to write something because the specifics, in relation to Chinese individuals, have long been largely ignored, she said. Agreye, an Indonesian-Australian journalist and writer of Chinese descent, previously wrote a 2014 non-fiction Indonesian book, titled The 1998 Tragedy and the Birth of the National Commission for Women, which detailed accounts and reports of Chinese people being targeted and raped, but the book was never translated into English. Agreye said despite attempts and commissions set up by the Indonesian government to investigate the reports of the rapes, the story has gone largely unaddressed until this day, and therefore many Chinese Indonesians still suffer from a lack of reconciliation. There has been recognition, though somewhat reluctantly, about the burning of buildings, the looting of Chinese-owned goods, as well as the shooting of students, Agreye said. Agreye said the Indonesian government has downplayed the targeting of Chinese during the riots, despite U.S. State Department and human rights reports noting dozens of cases of rapes, by maintaining that there is no forensic evidence to examine or victims willing to come forward. So at that time, I wrote the book in Indonesian, because many people in Indonesia still did not know about the rape, Agreye explains, when asked why the book was never translated. In the years since, Agreye said she was inspired by the accounts of many of the victims, as well many of the 2014 book's readers and her colleagues urging her to translate it into English. But without a translator, Agreye said she herself was too drained from the labor-intensive experience of writing the historical account in Indonesian to translate it herself, so instead opted to use the research to create a new novel, in English, My Pain, My Country. Agreye said she also believed the fiction format would be more appropriate for English readers, as it offers the freedom to interweave stories with more emotional depth, rather than academically detailing historical accounts.